My patron Rene has said, "Hi Tick, I have really fallen in love with your channel, by far the coolest channel on World War II on the net. I love your but is this really the case? I have a question though, have you ever considered doing something on the prelude to war? Like say ask the question, did Poland bring on herself her own destruction because of her aggressive foreign policy? We just had a debate here in Sweden on the subject, based on statements that Putin made. Now, since I am Czech, and know a little bit about the prelude to war, the question is actually itching for a serious digging into." Yes, we have a Czech guy living in Sweden talking about Poland's aggression based on the comments that the Russian president has made. Wow. I love it. Thanks for triggering most of Eastern Europe, and the people in the West like me who were not taught much about non-Western perspectives in World War II will probably have no idea that there was a narrative out there that says that Poland was aggressive and brought on her own destruction. So this question has probably annoyed most of the world, which is fantastic. Now that everyone is suffering from cognitive dissonance, the first thing we need to do is look at the statements that Putin made, and I'll leave a link in the description to the full article so you can read all of Putin's words to your heart's content. But here are some of the things that Putin said. Poland was also engaged in the partition of Czechoslovakia along with Germany. They decided together in advance who would get what Czechoslovak territories. Poland was aware that without Hitler's support, its annexationist plans were doomed to fail. Today, European politicians, and Polish leaders in particular, wish to sweep the Munich betrayal under the carpet. Why? The fact that their countries once broke their commitments and supported the Munich betrayal, with some of them even participating in divvying up the take, is not the only reason. Another is that it is kind of embarrassing to recall that during those dramatic days of 1938, the Soviet Union was the only one to stand up for Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union, in accordance with its international obligations, including agreements with France and Czechoslovakia, tried to prevent the tragedy from happening. Meanwhile, Poland, in pursuit of its interests, was doing its utmost to hamper the establishment of a collective security system in Europe. Poland played its role in the failure of those negotiations as it did not want to have any obligations to the Soviet side. Even under pressure from the Western Allies, the Polish leadership rejected the idea of joint action with the Red Army to fight against the Wehrmacht. It was only when they learned of the arrival of Ribbentrop to Moscow that J. Beck reluctantly and not directly, through French diplomats, notified the Soviet side. In the event of joint action against the German aggression, cooperation between Poland and the Soviet Union is not out of the question, in technical circumstances which remain to be agreed. At the same time, he explained to his colleagues, "I agreed to this wording only for the sake of the tactics, and our core position in relation to the Soviet Union is final and remains unchanged." In these circumstances, the Soviet Union signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Germany. It was practically the last among the European countries to do so. Besides, it was done in the face of a real threat of war on two fronts, with Germany in the west and with Japan in the east. It will suffice to remember the cynical phrase said by Polish ambassador to Germany, J. Lipski, during his conversation with Hitler on 20th of September 1938. "For solving the Jewish problem, we, the Poles, will build in his honour a splendid monument in Warsaw." Besides, we do not know if there were any secret protocols or annexes to agreements of a number of countries with the Axis. The only thing that is left to do is to take their word for it. In particular, materials pertaining to the secret Anglo-German talks still have not been declassified. Therefore, we urge all states to step up the process of making their archives public and publishing previously unknown documents of the war and pre-war periods, the way Russia has done it in recent years. But let us go back to the events immediately preceding the Second World War. It was naive to believe that Hitler, once done with Czechoslovakia, would not make new territorial claims. This time, the claims involved its recent accomplice in the partition of Czechoslovakia, Poland. Here, the legacy of Versailles, particularly the fate of the so-called Danzig Corridor, was yet again used as the pretext. The blame for the tragedy that Poland then suffered lies entirely with the Polish leadership, which had impeded the formation of a military alliance between Britain, France and the Soviet Union, and relied on the help from its Western partners, throwing its own people under the steamroller of Hitler's machine of destruction. There's more in here than what I've just read out, but Putin's views are very clear, and I'm sure many of you will be disagreeing with them. However, I also know that many of you will be agreeing with them too. When I hinted in my video on the Hossbach Memorandum that there was someone else in Europe pushing the narrative that Hitler was just an innocent guy who didn't start World War II, but said I didn't want to mention any names because I didn't want to be assassinated with nuclear poison, not only did most of you know exactly who I was talking about, even though I didn't mention his name, which is interesting, but some of you proceeded to claim that Putin never said such things. Well, if Putin thinks Poland's aggressive foreign policy brought on her own destruction, and thus caused Hitler to go to war, then this implies that Poland is to blame for the start of the Second World War, and that Hitler was reacting to events, and thus was an innocent guy, along with Stalin. Now, I have nothing against Putin personally. I don't have views on him either way, apart from this and the nuclear poison thing. I do take exception to this anti-Polish narrative though, because this is entirely in line with what the Nazi and Soviet narrative is. The Nazis are also very vocal in saying that Poland and Britain are to blame for the start of the Second World War, and the pro-Nazi and pro-Soviet arguments are very, very similar. I don't think Mr. Putin is aware that his views are mostly shared by the Nazis. I also believe that Mr. Putin has made a basic historical mistake, namely that he understands what the Soviet perspective is, the Stalin perspective, and agrees wholeheartedly with it, but hasn't taken the time to understand what the other perspectives are, and is just viewing things from the Soviet perspective. Now, it's fine to say this is the Soviet perspective, but it would be false to assume that just because the Soviets believed that the other so-called capitalist powers were scheming to work with Hitler as a way to strike against the Soviet Union, doesn't mean that that was actually what the other powers were doing. And if Mr. Putin took the time to actually look at what the other powers were doing from their own perspectives, he'd quickly see that history is about combining loads of different perspectives, judging them against each other and figuring out which elements are right and which are wrong. But Mr. Putin hasn't done this and is simply embraced the Soviet perspective, which is flawed. Of course, because this is the Soviet perspective, this means the views that Mr. Putin has expressed have been around for a long time. He certainly isn't the first to state such things, and the best sources that defend this view on Poland are actually the Nazi sources. In fact, in a follow-up message, Rene mentioned that he had chatted with someone online about the topic of Poland's aggression, and the person he chatted to had provided him with another source, which just happens to share many of Putin's views. Rene says, "I have no idea who sent it, although given context I have my suspicions." Upon examining the source, I quickly realised that Rene's suspicions were correct. The source was written by a historian called David Hoggan, and the PDF is hosted on what is clearly an anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi website. The book is The Forced War, which was originally written in 1961. And yes, this is the same book that I tore apart in my video on the Hossbach Memorandum, link in the description. It's the source I had to do a pirate's accent for, because the book had no notes, no bibliography, and no index. Arg. The publishing house of the book is the Institute for Historical Review, which is infamous for promoting Holocaust denialism. Yes, the Institute itself claims it doesn't deny the Holocaust, but the people whose work get published do deny it, as do the people who work at the Institute. Again, having no sources or evidence to back up its claims would normally be enough for me to justify dismissing the source in its entirety. However, considering that many of the views it gives are shared by Mr. Putin, it can't just be dismissed without debunking. And because it was a published book, and the fact you can still find second-hand copies around for a price that's simply not worth it, I'm going to assume that a bibliography and an index and footnotes were present in the original publication. The overall message that Hoggan delivers is similar to Putin's, although there are differences. Hoggan argues that Poland was the aggressive party and that Hitler just had to attack Poland. When it comes to the critical months between September 1938 and September 1939, however, it is my carefully considered judgment that the primary responsibility was that of Poland and Great Britain. For the Polish-German War, the responsibility was that of Poland, Britain, and Germany in this order of so-called guilt. For the onset of a European war, which later grew into a world war with the entry of the Soviet Union, Japan, and the United States, the responsibility was primarily, indeed almost exclusively, that of Lord Halifax and Great Britain. The problem is, this narrative is propped up with half-truths and doublespeak, and doesn't take much knowledge or reading to see through the lies. Unfortunately, or luckily depending how you see it, we don't have time here to go through every single page and every single point debunking the whole thing, because it's 350 pages long. But what we can do is go through each of Putin's points, use Hoggen to flesh them out so that we have as good an argument as can be presented in favour of Putin's views, then explain why these points don't work using additional evidence from elsewhere. The good news is that most of Putin's points revolve around the Munich crisis, so we don't have to go through the whole history of Poland. But let us go back to the events immediately preceding the Second World War. It was naive to believe that Hitler, once done with Czechoslovakia, would not make new territorial claims. This time, the claims involved its recent accomplice in the partition of Czechoslovakia, Poland. Here, the legacy of Versailles, particularly the fate of the so-called Danzig Corridor, was yet again used as the pretext. Okay, let's start off by discussing the Treaty of Versailles, Poland's situation, and the Danzig Corridor, so that we can have a bit of context prior to hitting the Czechoslovakian issue. It was the US President, Woodrow Wilson, who provided the rationale for the national self-determination policy that the signers of the Treaty of Versailles would adopt. In theory, national self-determination would align ethnic groups with nation-state boundaries, both to reduce causes of conflict and to provide political representation to groups that felt that the old empires had denied it to them. So note that rather than trying to create conflict, the idea was to reduce conflict. The Western powers didn't want another war. That was their motivation for many of the things that they did. They wanted to avoid a second war. Now, did they mess up? Yes. Did they mess up deliberately? I don't think so. I think their intention was to maintain peace and ignorantly believed that creating independent national states would prevent wars from occurring. The problem, of course, is that it was difficult to draw national boundaries that would satisfy everyone. Europe had developed under monarchies, not national states. A lot of people didn't identify as nationalities, they had just existed as individuals under a monarch. Well, now they were being asked to identify as a social group, as nationalities. So there were massive non-national minorities within the borders of each state or even each province. Therefore, no matter where they drew the borders, it was going to be wrong. A great example of this was that there were Alsatians in Alsace-Lorraine who didn't see themselves as either French nor German. So, should Alsace-Lorraine become a separate nation? In theory, yes. In practice, of course, no. A separate Alsace-Lorraine didn't happen. A second consideration was that there had to be a balance of power in Europe, again to try and stop a Second World War from occurring. Well, it was thought that larger states could stand up to bigger states than smaller states could. That's why Romania ended up doubling in size, despite the fact that many people in the new Romanian territories weren't Romanian. It was to help prevent Germany or the Soviet Union from dominating Eastern Europe. For the same reason, the mountainous region of the Sudetenland was given to Czechoslovakia, because it was thought that this would allow them to defend their borders from Germany. Thus, a large number of Sudeten Germans were within their borders. This highlighted the contradiction between ethnic and strategic rationales for redrawing borders. It also underscored the problems of using national self-determination as a guide to national frontiers. Well, turning to Poland, these exact issues became obvious when they started drawing her borders. Most areas where there was a Polish majority, there was also a German, Ukrainian or other minority. Few Poles lived near the coast, but Wilson thought that Poland should have access to the sea for strategic and economic reasons, and thus should get the port of Danzig, Gdansk, even though this had a German majority. To refuse it to Poland would deny the new state a chance to sell its goods overseas, but to take it away from Germany would violate the principle of national self-determination. They could have brought in troops and forcibly moved people from one place to another in order to make the nationalities in a province reflect the new national borders, but the diplomats in 1919 thought that this wasn't a good idea. So, in the end, a new Polish state came into being. It did have access to the sea, but the port of Danzig became an independent, free city, which was open for both Germany and Poland to use for trade. Germans in the city had to give up their German nationality, and this, of course, cut off East Prussia from the German heartland. Many German nationalists saw this as ridiculous, and indeed, so does Mr. Hoggen. The ultimate treaty terms gave Poland much more than she deserved, and much more than she should have requested. Most of West Prussia, which had a German majority at the last census, was surrendered to Poland without plebiscite, and later the richest industrial section of Upper Silesia was given to Poland despite the fact that the Poles lost the plebiscite there. The creation of a League protectorate for the national German community of Danzig was a disastrous move. A free harbour for Poland in a Danzig under German rule would have been far more equitable. The chief errors of the treaty included the creation of the corridor, the creation of the so-called Free City of Danzig, and the cession of part of Upper Silesia to Poland. These errors were made for the benefit of Poland and to the disadvantage of Germany, but they were detrimental to both Germany and Poland. An enduring peace in the German-Polish borderlands was impossible to achieve within the context of these terms. To give a similar example, it's like Alaska not being connected to the bulk of the USA. You know, clearly it would be impossible to achieve an enduring peace with these borders, so I guess the United States is just going to have to invade Canada. I mean, it's the only way to solve this issue. And then when Canada is completely annexed into the United States, its people need to be starved and enslaved for, reasons. I mean, that's the only option, obviously. And experience tells me that there's a significant minority of people who watch my videos who don't understand what sarcasm is. So let me make it blatantly clear. I'm not actually advocating this, because this is a stupid idea. Just like it's a stupid idea to invade, destroy and enslave Poland because you don't know how to swim, or fly a plane, or negotiate the passage of vehicles through this territory. And before you jump down my throat with the excuse that the Poles weren't negotiating, yeah, maybe not by 1939, but it was Hitler who was autarkic. He didn't believe in trade or negotiating or passage through this territory. He believed in bringing all German blood and soil back to the Reich. So don't even go there. This isn't an issue at all, but Hitler made it an issue. And this is the legacy of Versailles that Putin brings up. But it should be obvious to us all, simply by looking at a map, that Poland was in a precarious position. They had hostile neighbours to their west and east, specifically Germany and the Soviet Union, and both Germany and the Soviet Union were aggressive powers. Of course, not to Mr. Hoggen. Throughout his book, Mr. Hoggen tries to make out that Poland was the aggressor and was hostile to Germany and the Soviet Union, and thus she got what she deserved. On page 25 he says that the Soviets didn't know that the Polish-Romanian alliance of 1921 was directed primarily at the Soviet Union. Well, this is a distortion of history. The alliance of 1921, which implies aggression, was actually a defensive alliance which was not aggressive. It was created to defend against the Soviet attack coming from the east. The Soviet Union under Lenin had just wiped out their own country, murdering millions, and their Marxist-socialist ideology called for world revolution, aka imperial world conquest, and they were actively trying to expand that revolution abroad. Workers of the world unite and all that. So they were a hostile neighbour, which is why they ended up in conflict in the early 1920s and why a defensive alliance was necessary. The defensive alliance was to protect themselves from an ideology which had openly proclaimed its warmongering intentions. Germany, as we've explained, really wanted to unite Alaska with the United States. Sorry, East Prussia with the German heartland, and thus was also hostile to Poland. The issue, though, is that Putin and Hagen are twisting the truth in order to push their narrative. Again, on page 25 of his book, Hagen makes the case that during the Weimar years, Poland and Germany were at odds with each other, and says there was a German-Polish trade war from 1925 onwards. But he then fails to say who started it, because that would go against his Poland was the aggressor narrative. It turns out that it was Germany who aggressively started the trade war in 1925 as a way to cause a breakdown of the Polish economy. That's perhaps why, from 1926 onwards, the defensive alliance between Poland and Romania was expanded to include aggression from the West as well as the East. But the only reason the 1921 defensive alliance wasn't directed at the West was because Poland didn't want to become involved in wars in the Balkans, which she feared Romania would get her into. Clearly, if Poland doesn't want to become involved in wars, then Poland's actions here were obviously defensive in nature, not aggressive. Yet, the way that Hagen words it implies that the Poles were aggressively scheming against the Soviets and Germans, when in reality these were defensive moves. So Poland found herself between a rock and a hard place, and in order to survive, she had to act defensively. But apparently, when Poland acts defensively, this makes her the aggressor, as Hagen continues to state. The policy of Poland toward Germany during the last years of the Weimar Republic was a combination of threats and an effort to keep Germany impotent. Of course, it wasn't that Germany was making aggressive moves against Poland, and Poland was reacting to this in ways designed to make Germany impotent. No, apparently, Poland was making moves against Germany to keep her impotent because she, Poland, was the supposed aggressor in this relationship. Do you see how the language is twisted? And bearing in mind, these last few points have all come from page 25 of Hagen's book. That's several distortions in just one page of text. The book is 350 pages long, and it just goes on and on like this, right? Distortion after distortion, half-truth after half-truth, lie after lie, page after page. And I've already exposed Hagen's views on the Hosspack Memorandum in my previous video, a whole 50-minute video debunking the view Hagen presented in what wasn't even a page of his book. I could literally go through every single page of his book and rip it apart. But it's not worth our time. The point is that this book is completely untrustworthy and is little more than Nazi propaganda. Ultimately, what we have to remember is that Nazi Germany needed to expand eastwards due to her own ideology. Not only had Hitler made it clear in Mein Kampf that only an eastern policy of expansion would solve their soil crisis, Lebensraum, but because of their attempts to create a socialist economy, the German economy was imploding. As Gotz Ali shows in Hitler's Beneficiaries, if the Germans hadn't conquered Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland when she had, then they would have been in real economic trouble. Their only solution was to go to war in order to plunder the resources of Europe and export their financial problems abroad. And this is important to note because while Putin and Hagen tried to pin the blame on Poland, in reality, it was Germany that was compelled to go to war. Poland may have made mistakes, as did the Soviet Union and the West, but Hitler and the Nazis are the ones who are really to blame here because they actively wanted war. But anyway, all this should provide you with the context as to why Poland was reacting to events and trying to forge alliances and so on. Hitler gets elected in 1933 and immediately cuts ties with the Soviet Union because he thought Marxism was Jewish. He then starts being friendly with Poland, A trade agreement was made with the Poles, and then later a non-aggression pact with the Poles was signed on the 26th of January 1934. Interestingly though, Putin remarks that, "In these circumstances, the Soviet Union signed the non-aggression pact with Germany. It was practically the last among the European countries to do so. Besides, it was done in the face of a real threat of war on two fronts, with Germany in the west and with Japan in the east." So notice, Poland was one of the first countries to sign a non-aggression pact with Germany, and that's bad. But when the Soviet Union does it, it's good. And even though the Soviet Union did it because it was faced with a real threat of war on two fronts, and thus Putin claims the Soviet Union was justified to sign a pact with Germany, when Poland does it for the exact same reasons, it's bad. Poland and the Soviet Union both share a very similar fate here. Both signed non-aggression pacts with Germany, and both were betrayed by Germany. Both were, maybe, trying to avoid conflict. Hence why they signed non-aggression pacts rather than full-on offensive alliances. Oh, but wait, we know that, unlike the Polish-German non-aggression pact, the Soviet-German pact had secret protocols, which carved up Eastern Europe between the Germans and the Soviets. In the secret protocol, the Soviet Union laid claim to Finland, Estonia and Latvia up to the border of Lithuania, with the latter earmarked for Germany. This is why I refer to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as an alliance, which it technically wasn't, but in reality was. Hitler and Stalin were allies in all but name. Whereas Poland's non-aggression pact with Germany was just that, a non-aggression pact. That is why Putin is quick to counter with, "Besides, we do not know if there were any secret protocols or annexes to agreements of a number of countries with the Axis. The only thing that is left to do is to take their word for it. In particular, materials pertaining to the secret Anglo-German talks still have not been declassified. Therefore, we urge all states to step up the process of making their archives public and publishing previously unknown documents of the war and pre-war periods, the way Russia has done it in recent years." He says this because he knows people will call out the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So obviously, if the Nazis and the Marxists had a secret protocol which allowed them to carve up Eastern Europe together, then Putin claims that Poland or the Western Allies must also have had secret protocols with Nazi Germany. There's no evidence for this at all, but it must be true because Putin said so. Now, on the one hand, the Royal Archives and others are still under lock and key, with numerous documents relating to the Hesse affair, for example, still not being allowed to surface due to so-called national security reasons. So Putin is correct that our overlords are keeping things secret from us, and Putin is correct that the archives should be opened up fully, which his own archives haven't been, by the way, despite what he claims. However, Putin is wrong to jump to the conclusion that secret protocols existed in other treaties. Yes, they could have had secret protocols, but we can't presume that they did. We need evidence to confirm it. When the archives are opened, and if secret protocols exist, then we can go ahead and reassess the situation. Until that happens, though, we have to work on the assumption that secret protocols didn't exist because we don't have evidence confirming that they do. Plus, it doesn't make sense for there to be any secret protocols for the other treaties. Poland, Britain and France ended up at war with Germany due to German expansion. So what possible secret protocol could exist that ends up with the Allies declaring war on Germany? It doesn't make any sense for there to be a secret protocol in the German-Polish non-aggression pact, whereas it does make sense with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, ended up in an alliance with Nazi Germany in all but name as a result of German and Soviet expansion. Poland didn't do this. Therefore, Poland probably didn't write a secret protocol. Also, what Putin has forgotten here is that the dividing up of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union and Germany was actually prompted by Stalin, not Hitler. Discussions swiftly moved to the essence of the Nazi-Soviet agreement, the so-called secret protocol by which both parties were to divide the spoils of their collaboration. The initiative came from the Soviet side. Realizing that Hitler was impatient to proceed with his invasion plans for Poland, Stalin sought to extract the maximum possible territorial concession. Slightly later, for Stalin it marked an astonishing success. With a single evening's negotiation and a single phone call, he had regained almost all the lands lost by the Russian Empire in the maelstrom of the First World War. But Putin's pushing the narrative that the Soviet Union was forced into signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact after the Western powers rejected the creation of a military alliance with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. Obviously there was no alternative, otherwise the USSR would face seriously increased risks because, I will say this again, the old Soviet-Polish border ran only within a few tens of kilometers from Minsk. The country would have to enter the inevitable war with the Nazis from very disadvantageous strategic positions, while millions of people of different nationalities, including the Jews living in Poland, would be left to die at the hands of the Nazis and their local accomplices, anti-Semites and radical nationalists. So this is the opposite of what really happened. Nobody forced Stalin to call for the joint carving up of Eastern Europe with the Nazis. Let's say that the Western Allies and Poland had failed to create a collective security system in Europe. Okay, well, why didn't the Soviet Union stand up to Hitler on their own? Supposedly, they eventually did. So why not do so earlier? Unlike the West, which simply failed to stop Hitler at this point, the Soviet Union not only failed as well, but actively pursued a pseudo-alliance with the Nazis. Their main criticism of the West after Munich was that the West had cut a deal with Hitler. Okay, that's a skewed way of looking at it, but even if that was true, that doesn't mean that you have to actually then cut a deal with Hitler. Why would you stoop to their level, right? Think of the logic. Okay, there's a murderer running around, and the guys over there have supposedly cut a deal with the murderer. Okay, well, instead of stopping the murderer myself, I'll forge an alliance with him, and we'll murder people together. Right? But if you complain, no, they cut a deal with him, so I'm allowed to murder as well. Like, what kind of logic is that? I mean, it's insane. And yet, that's the logic that's being presented here. Yes, the West messed up and failed to stop Hitler. That doesn't mean that Stalin has the moral right to work with Hitler and then annex most of Eastern Europe. So even if this idea that the West and Poland were trying to cut a deal with Hitler, even if that was true, which I would argue it wasn't, then it still doesn't justify what the Soviet Union did. But it's not true that Poland was actually trying to work with the Nazis. Even Mr. Hogan has to admit that the Poles were simultaneously putting pressure on the Czechs whilst also defying the Germans, who were pushing for the German annexation of Danzig and the Danzig Corridor. And they were working with the British in that regard, trying to establish a collective security system in Europe, to borrow Putin's words. So clearly, there was some nuance to Polish strategy at this time, which both Mr. Putin and Mr. Hogan seem to have ignored. Yes, Poland was pursuing her own interests in blocking Soviet moves into Europe. Poland and Germany, supported by Italy, had already successfully worked together on toppling the Romanian Foreign Minister Nicolae Tătălescu, who had been a proponent of the Little Entente between Romania, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and had declared herself willing, if Czechoslovakia needed help, to allow Soviet troops to advance through Romania. By toppling him, the Polish Foreign Minister, Beck, secured another protective anti-Soviet buffer for his own country, but contributed to the isolation of Czechoslovakia. So notice, Poland is trying to stop both the Nazis and the Soviets, who are both as bad as each other. She successfully prevented the Soviets from expanding into Europe, but then, of course, this isolated Czechoslovakia. However, this doesn't mean that the Poles were working for the Germans, or were trying to hamper the collective security system of Europe. The Soviet Union was also an aggressive power. Mr. Putin seems to have forgotten this, and Putin has also forgotten this fact as well. Back when Stalin had agreed to mutual assistance pacts with France and Czechoslovakia, he had pledged to come to the latter's aid if France did so first. Yes, because France didn't go to war over Czechoslovakia, Stalin wouldn't go to war for her either. So the argument that Poland stopped the Soviets from helping the Czechs is completely false, because the Soviets were relying on the French, and the French weren't interested in fighting the Germans at this time. Now, yes, the Soviets could still have intervened if they wanted to do so, and this is where the idea that the Polish blocked the Soviets comes from. But as Kotkin points out, not only did the Poles not block them, but the Romanians did too. Why? Partly because nobody wanted the Red Army on their territory, for reasons that should be blatantly obvious, and partly because the Soviets had already claimed portions of Romanian territory by this point, again showing that she was an aggressive power. And as Kotkin also explains, London, Paris and Berlin all judged the Red Army incapable of decisive intervention abroad. After all, Stalin had decapitated his own officer corps. And this needs to be taken seriously. The Soviet Union wasn't prepared for war in 1941. I've covered this in numerous videos, so what makes Putin think it would have done any better in 1938 or 1939? The only reason it took eastern Poland was because the bulk of the Polish army had already been smashed by the Germans in the west, and the Red Army faced token resistance. The only reason they took the Baltic states was because they offered no resistance, and when Finland decided to fight, the Red Army received a bloody nose. There's no reason to assume that the Red Army was capable of fighting in Central Europe in 1938. Mr. Putin also seems to have forgotten that, throughout this time, Poland refused Hitler's repeated offers to join the Anti-Comintern Pact. Poland had also tried to re-establish the historic Polish-Lithuanian Union in 1938, but Hitler didn't want Poland to take Lithuania because this might block German expansion into the Baltic states, so he stopped this move. It's clear that Germany and Poland weren't seeing eye to eye here, even if they arguably cooperated together in the carve-up of Czechoslovakia. Poland played its role in the failure of these negotiations as it did not want to have any obligations to the Soviet side. Correct, it did not want the Soviet Union taking over southern and central Europe, and thus putting Poland in a precarious situation. Even under pressure from the Western Allies, the Polish leadership rejected the idea of joint action with the Red Army to fight against the Wehrmacht. Well, no, the Western Allies wanted to avoid a war, not start one. And also, just because Poland didn't trust the Soviet Union, a regime with a brutal ideology that caused the deaths of millions of people, this doesn't mean the Soviet regime had permission to invade Poland. Poland didn't want Soviet troops on her soil because she correctly guessed that once Soviet troops were on foreign soil, they wouldn't leave. When Soviet troops marched into the Baltic states, they didn't leave. They also marched into western Poland and didn't leave, and marched into parts of Romania and didn't leave. They would have done the same with Finland had the Finns not fought back. And after the war, Soviet troops marched into Eastern Europe and again didn't leave until the entire Soviet regime collapsed many years later. So Poland rejected Soviet assistance because she feared being annexed by the Soviet Union, which in the end half of her territory was, and the rest of it became a vassal state of the Soviets after the war anyway. So we can certainly understand why Poland refused Soviet help. And Poland only rejected the Soviet Union, it didn't reject the help of the Western Allies, which is why they ended up in the war together against the Nazis. The French and British were the ones who decided not to go to war during the Czech crisis, although there was a partial mobilisation, and it was the British and French who were the ones really pushing to avoid war, and thus were in favour of a deal with Hitler. So, while Poland did take a small portion of Czech territory, it can't be said that they were the primary force behind the carve-up. The primary force was Hitler, and Chamberlain gave in to him. Chamberlain allowed himself to imagine that he was fixing the Versailles Treaty by removing the supposed cause of German aggression: too many ethnic Germans living outside German borders. Now, obviously this turned out to be a false belief because Hitler didn't just want to unite the German people, but he also wanted to expand eastwards to get the land and resources he needed to found a socialist paradise. But Chamberlain, wanting to avoid another war and believing that the Versailles Treaty was wrong, hoped that by giving Hitler some land that Germans were already living in would prevent another major European conflict. It still seemed unclear to Chamberlain that Hitler was bent on European conquest, rather than merely determined to right the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles and protect beleaguered ethnic German minorities. If he could be appeased on the Sudeten question, then maybe he would be satisfied and a general war could be avoided. Chamberlain determined to intervene decisively to prevent a war by forcing the Czechs to give way. It wasn't because, as Mr. Hoggins says, that Chamberlain was actually looking to start a fight with Germany, but Britain was behind with her rearmament program and therefore needed to delay. I mean, not only is this the literal opposite of what happened, but even if this was true, this actually undermines Putin's argument, because if Chamberlain was the aggressor against Germany, then Chamberlain didn't cut a deal with Germany. He was just delaying his aggressive attack on Germany. Also, Poland wouldn't be the aggressor, Britain would be. And this is where Putin's and Hoggins' views deviate. I don't want to get bogged down here in the intricacies of Chamberlain's views, but the point is that Chamberlain was trying to prevent a wider conflict rather than trying to cut a deal with Hitler. Chamberlain presented Hitler with a declaration that Britain and Germany would never go to war again. Hitler signed it without demur. On his return to England, Chamberlain waved it at cheering crowds from the first floor window of number 10 Downing Street. "I believe it is peace for our time," he told them. He genuinely seems to have believed that he had achieved a settlement that was satisfactory to all, including the Czechs, who he declared had been saved for a happier future. What is also important to note is that Chamberlain thought that the Versailles Treaty was unjust and was actually trying to rectify it. This actually goes against Mr. Hoggins' idea that Britain was pro-Versailles and anti-Hitler. In reality, up until Hitler started getting aggressive with Poland in the March of 1939, Britain was trying to rectify the Versailles Treaty. Even A.J.P. Taylor explains this, a historian Mr. Hoggin praised and mentioned in his book. Chamberlain went armed only with the prejudice of most Englishmen against Versailles and the firm conviction that Hitler would become pacific if German national grievances were met. What Mr. Putin has also failed to note is that while Poland was sort of cooperating with the Nazis in 1938, this changed by March 1939, when relations between the two countries soured. Even the British realised that the situation had changed. After the Poles rejected Hitler's demands, Chamberlain guaranteed Polish independence, having now understood that the appeasement policy wasn't working. The issue that Poland faced was that she was surrounded by two hostile powers. As Murray Rothbard points out, Poland had been caught between the millstones of the two great powers in Central Europe, Germany and Russia. It should have been clear to any Pole that Poland could prosper, in fact could exist as an independent country, only in alliance with either Germany, Russia or both. Any other course would be fatal. The Poles had rejected the idea of allying themselves with the Soviet Union, so they sided with the Germans until March of 1939. Then Hitler began calling for Polish territory, and Poland found herself surrounded by two hostile neighbours. The Poles still didn't want Soviet help, but they did stand up to Hitler and they did have the support of the Western Allies. The Soviet Union then decided to become friendly with the Germans and then carve up Poland together with them. So this was a fundamental flaw when it comes to Poland's strategic position on the map. I've talked about the issue of siding with the Germans in another video and how that just simply didn't work out because Hitler was going east and Poland was in the way. There was no way to jointly paint the map of Eastern Europe between Poland and Germany. One or the other had to go, and Poland went. And yes, theoretically, Poland could have sided with the Soviet Union, but that would have also brought its own problems. I mean, even if she had survived, she probably would have become a vassal state of the Soviets. So Poland's strategic position was simply flawed. Now, there's a whole debate about what Poland should or shouldn't have done to stop itself being destroyed, or whether it was inevitable or not. I'm not going to get into it because it's complicated and this video isn't the place for it. Maybe in a future video we can discuss this. However, regardless of whatever alternative course Poland should have taken, she would still be reacting to the aggressive moves of either the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. So the issue isn't Poland's aggression, Hitler and Stalin are the issue. And going back to this idea that Putin puts out that Poland engaged in the carve-up of Czechoslovakia, and that Poland was wrong to work with the Germans. Well, if Poland was wrong to cut a deal with the Germans to carve up Czechoslovakia in 1938, the Soviet Union was wrong to cut a deal with the Germans in the carve-up of Poland in 1939 for the exact same reason. The Soviet Union could have just sat out of the conflict, but it didn't. It decided to strike a deal with the Nazi regime and jointly invaded Poland with them. And this wasn't to create a collective security system or anything like that. It was purely a land grab. Imperialism. Prior to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin kept channels open to both the Germans and the Anglo-French side, intent on obtaining the best deal he could for the Soviet Union. Aware that Hitler had firmly decided to attack Poland and was therefore eager to ensure Soviet neutrality, the Soviets endeavoured to obtain agreement from the British and French to begin military talks. Stalin, having received assurance from Hitler that there would be a secret protocol to the non-aggression pact that would likely grant him the concessions he had sought in Poland, the Baltic, Finland and Romania, wrote to him agreeing to the pact and expressing willingness to receive Foreign Minister Ribbentrop on August 23rd in Moscow. This was about conquering territory, an aggressive move on the part of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Socialist imperialism. In fact, during the negotiations with the Western Allies in the summer of 1939, Stalin made it clear that he wanted the Baltic states, and the excuse he came up with was that the Baltic states could be used as a springboard for aggressive actions against the Soviet Union, therefore he needed what he called guarantees for the Baltics. Some British officials internally urged that London accede to Soviet security demands for guarantees for the Baltics, even while conceding that Stalin might then have a pretext to seize them. But Chamberlain, who had handed Hitler Czechoslovakia, refused. Stalin was stupefied. The British imperialists had seized 1/4 of the earth across oceans, and yet they kept invoking principle in a refusal to allow him to protect himself in connection with microscopic territories contiguous with the Soviet homeland that until recently had belonged to Russia and that represented a threat. And if it was all about stopping the Germans, then why didn't the Soviet Union strike Germany after Poland had been carved up? They had a golden opportunity where the Germans were battling in the West. But no, they didn't do that. And they didn't do it because they weren't interested in stopping Hitler at this point. The Soviet Union simply wanted territory. Soviet policy in 1939 is still routinely described, particularly by those who cleave to a rosy view of the Soviet Union, as being essentially defensive in nature, motivated by a desire to hold Hitler off and buy time to prepare for an inevitable attack. This has, at the very least, a modicum of retrospective logic to it, but it finds no contemporary echo whatsoever. The Soviet Union saw territorial expansion and the spreading of communism as part of its raison d'etre. It had sought to expand west in 1920 and did so with spectacular results in 1944-45. There is no reason to suppose that Western expansion was not part of the plan in 1939. Indeed, it actually happened. Stalin expanded westwards in 1939 and 1940, so this is true. And Stalin's ultimate goal was to wait for the capitalist Western allies and the so-called fascists to exhaust themselves in the West, then swoop in to conquer Europe, and Stalin himself spelled this out. A war is on between two groups of capitalist countries for the redivision of the world, for the domination of the world. We see nothing wrong in their having a good hard fight and weakening each other. It would be fine if, as the hands of Germany, the position of the richest capitalist countries, especially England, were shaken. Hitler, without understanding it or desiring it, is shaking and undermining the capitalist system. We can maneuver, pit one side against the other, to set them fighting with each other as fiercely as possible. Molotov confirms this view. We are more firmly convinced now than ever that our brilliant comrade, Lenin, was not mistaken when he assured us that the Second World War will help us to gain power throughout all Europe as the first helped us to gain power in Russia. So you can see the contrast here between what actually happened and Putin's rosy view of what happened. Putin interprets the Munich betrayal, where Chamberlain and the West tried to appease Hitler in order to prevent him from expanding any further, as the West cutting a deal with Hitler. Well, this is exactly what Stalin and the Soviets thought at the time, and that view has more to do with Stalin's paranoia than anything else. Putin then says that the Soviet Union was the only one to stand up for Czechoslovakia, and that Poland was trying to hamper the establishment of a collective security system in Europe. Which is clearly false because Britain, France and Czechoslovakia also partially mobilised as a result of the Czech crisis. Putin's views are also false because the Soviet Union was actively trying to gain territory in Europe. So, unless you think that a collective security system in Europe consisted of deceptive conquest by the Soviet Union, which is what Stalin's ultimate objective was, then there's no way you could agree with Putin's views. Overall, there are serious flaws in Mr. Putin's and Mr. Hoggin's accounts of what happened prior to the Second World War, and the evidence points us to an alternate conclusion. Effectively, what I think has happened here is that Mr. Putin has read and understood the Soviet view of what happened, which is based on Stalin's distorted paranoia, but hasn't read or has rejected any other view of what happened. So Mr. Putin is only seeing one part of the picture and is then pushing that for his own political reasons. Mr. Hoggin is doing the same, simply believing what the Nazis said and refusing to understand the views of anyone else. By doing this, they're both embracing a one-sided version of history. At best, what they're saying is a half-truth. It's true in the sense that this is what Stalin believed and this is what Hitler believed, but it's not true in the sense of the way Poland behaved, or the way Britain and France behaved, etc. They're only viewing Poland's actions from the outside, from the Soviet or German perspective, rather than from the Polish point of view, and this is where they're going wrong. So, going back to the original question, did Poland bring on herself her own destruction because of her aggressive foreign policy? This can only be answered with a simple no. Her destruction came about because of two aggressive powers, the National Socialist Germany and the Marxist Socialist Soviet Union. Yes, Poland made mistakes, just like Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and even Germany did, and yes, those mistakes contributed to her downfall. She did take a small amount of Czechoslovakian territory, she did try to form a union with Lithuania, she did block Soviet help, but it wasn't because of her supposed aggression. She was in a poor strategic position and was reacting to German and Soviet aggression as best as she could, which ultimately didn't work out for her. And reacting to events shouldn't be seen as an aggression. Thanks for watching, bye for now.